All right, Keith Pompey is joining me. He covers the Philadelphia 76ers for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I want to welcome everybody listening on AMP. You can follow me on AMP at Chris Mannix. It's the best way to get the first listen to this show. Also watching on YouTube as well. Subscribe to the Volume Sports YouTube page for video versions of the program. So, Keith, you are at the epicenter of one of the last remaining stories in the NBA. You've got the Portland Trail Blazers and the Damian Lillard saga in the Pacific Northwest. But on the East Coast, you have the ongoing will he or won't he be there saga with James Harden. I assume you did not get the chance to discuss James Harden with Joel Embiid at his wedding. I just assumed you were at the wedding. No, you did not make the final list for Joel Embiid's wedding.
I was on the persona non grata list probably.
I'd say this though, Keith. Sports Illustrated was well attended there. Anna DePaula, former SI swimsuit model. Yeah. I saw my Instagram feed was full of lots of, friends and family from the Sports Illustrated side that were in attendance at that wedding. Not necessarily the NBA side, but the swimsuit side as well.
Yeah. It looked like a nice thing. I saw the pictures too. I was like, wow. Okay, I'm just a reporter.
Ain't bad. Good work if you can get it. So I guess that's a good jumping off point to segue. You had a whole lot of Joel Embiid's Philadelphia 76ers teammates, friends from across the league at the wedding over the weekend. Noticeably absent was James Harden. Of all the things we're going to unpack today, let's I guess start there. Were you surprised that James Harden, the teammate of Embiid for the last year and a half, was not in the building?
Yes and no, and no because there's been last year Tobias Harris got married, and some of the teammates showed up, others didn't. You know what I mean? And I think something came up with Joel where he couldn't make it. James wasn't there, and when James, James likes to party, right? So James likes to do things. Now, is it a bad look from the outside looking in? Yes, it is. But I also would like to know what the conversation was like they had beforehand. That say, hey man, I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm going here. Here's a gift, this and that. But so without me knowing that, you say like, wow, James is really adamant about not returning to the 76ers because he didn't show up to the MVP's wedding. But at the same time, 3 weeks ago, they were laughing and joking and buddy chumming at Michael Rubin's party. So there's two ways to look at it. But if I'm a guy and I really want to get traded and not be there, the best way to do it is to not show up to the MVP or the franchise players a wedding. That's one stance that you can have. Yeah.
So what's your understanding about where we're at with all this? Because, just to put it all in perspective, James Harden, late June, decided to opt in to the final year, $35+ million on his contract. As part of that, he requested a trade from Philadelphia. We have had some public comments from Daryl Morey, who, of all the any issue I have with Daryl, I do love that he does these interviews and that he puts himself front and center and is visible during these situations. But Daryl Morey's, confirmed that James Harden wanted to be traded and said they're doing what they can or will do what they can to satisfy him. But it has been now 3.5 weeks since free agency officially opened. We know James Harden, is interested in going to the Clippers. The Clippers are interested in James Harden, but no deal has come close to being formed. Where do you think we are with all this?
I think we're in a holding pattern, really. Honestly, I don't think anything is going to happen, or terms are going to come down or go up or be agreed upon more so than they are right now until the start of the season. If then, I mean, when you look at it, I think, you talked about Dame Lillard in the what's going on there with the Portland Trail Blazers. I think that that has to be resolved or close to becoming resolved before something happens with James. Because let's face it, if you look at James and if you look at Dame, right now Dame is the better player, right? So if you're a team and you're willing to give up assets, you're going to give them up for Dame. And then once you figure out if Dame is going, then maybe you'll start listening to Daryl a little bit from teams outside of the Clippers. I think right now, and then I think that Daryl's in a tough spot. And what I mean by that is there's no one else to blame. Before you can always blame Doc Rivers for the shortcomings. Right now everything is on Daryl. And if you look at this team, you see where the Boston Celtics have made some improvements. You see the Milwaukee Bucks made some off-season improvements. The Sixers, their best player that they got was the backup center who they re-signed, who was a restricted free agent. So if you're Daryl Morey, you know that James lost a step, but you're not just going to trade him for the sake of trading him. You want to trade him to get someone so you can at least stay the third best team in the East. And, one can argue trading him for a bunch of role players is not going to do that. So he has to hold out for the best possible option, and hopefully think that there's going to be a team out there that desperately needs James to make a push and are willing to give us something with the Sixers deemed close to equal value. Will it happen? I don't know.
Yeah, Keith, is this just a question of money with James Harden, or is there more to the root of this? Because it was just back in February of 2021 when Harden was traded to Philadelphia. There was that embrace with Daryl Morey at the airport. Harden said, "This was where I always wanted to be." He gets a superstar teammate to play with. And you can certainly argue that this team's shortcomings as a team, its failure to advance past the second round, has a lot to do with James Harden and the way he performed in that second round series against Boston, especially those last two games of that series against Boston. Is this just as simple as he wants the money and Philadelphia wasn't willing to give it to him?
I think that's part of it. I also think that he wants to go somewhere where he said basketball freedom. I mean, I think James felt like he made a lot of sacrifices to play with Joel Embiid. And, he became more of a facilitator. He sacrificed his game. And I feel like the thing is, the worst thing that happened to the Sixers, and maybe James is a little reality a little bit, is when he had 45 points and 42 points against the Celtics. So James looks at it, he's still that guy. But I do think the money thing has a lot to do with it. I mean, James is a guy who, and he was right. When he first came here, everyone thought he was crazy when he kept saying, "Look, I'm going to do whatever it takes to help the 76ers." And we're like, "Yeah, okay, whatever. You're going to get paid." "No, I'm going to do whatever it takes." And he opts out of his deal and he takes 15 million less than what he was supposed to receive. And there's always those wink, wink deals where you think on the back end they're going to take care of me, and they didn't. So you see the frustration with that. But then also it's kind of like, look, I sacrificed my game. I took less money, and now it's like there's not a market for me. Like I was loyal to y'all, but y'all haven't been loyal to me, and maybe I need to go elsewhere. And so I think those are the two reasons why James wants out of here.
I think that James was surprised that there was zero interest from Houston because, the Houston stuff from the Rockets end, I believe fully that was real last year. I've talked to enough people within that organization to make me believe at the highest of levels, they wanted James Harden, from ownership to the general manager, Rafael Stone, that they were interested in bringing him back. Now, the variable that was introduced was Ime Udoka. And Ime Udoka is defense first. I go back a couple of years when Ime took the job in Boston. One of the first things he said to Brad Stevens was, "We need to keep Marcus Smart. Like, we want Marcus as our point guard because of his defense." He's trying to build something on that end of the floor, and James is not going to contribute to that. So I think Udoka getting that job in Houston threw a wrench into the plans of Harden. Took maybe the only team that was really interested off the table. You look at the teams that have cap space, Keith, whether it's Orlando, Detroit, they weren't going after, James Harden. The teams that might have wanted him, the Lakers, the Clippers, these contenders, Phoenix, they didn't have any money to offer him. So I really think that, the last, whenever Ime got hired, May, whenever it was, that changed everything for James Harden. Do you agree?
I do, but I also think that I think his teammates, when everybody felt like it was starting to become real, and then it was, you start hearing some whispers like, we don't know if we want to play with him. But you are correct, because think about it, during the hiring process, from what sources were saying is all the coaches who interviewed were asked, how do you feel about coaching James? And of course, they all said, oh, that would be great. And then Ime was like, no. And I think what I mean is Jalen Green. So when Ime is out there, like, like he said, yeah, then, but later it was like, no, I guess. But Ime, when Jalen Green came out on the Paul George podcast, and Paul George was the one who was basically saying, well, playing with James is kind of tough. And then Jalen was like, yeah, but I like, one of those. He was kind of non-committal either way, but the way that he answered it, it kind of let you know, like, well, maybe this isn't going to work, because these are young guys. They want to have the ball. And then Ime can come back and say, hey, look, it's not going to work out. And then I have Fred VanVleet, who's, younger, who's an all-star this year. Like, yeah, it really played in his hand. But I felt like you said, there was a time, especially right before the draft, where that's all everyone was talking about was James going back there. And I felt like, the players on the team and the coach basically destroyed all that.
Yeah, James never struck me as an Ime guy. And look, putting aside wherever James is at this point of his career, at least Ime had the level of sanity to realize it didn't make any sense. Bringing in a soon-to-be 34-year-old James Harden onto a team that, needs 2 or 3 years to build an identity before it can even consider accomplishing anything. Just, it never lined up to me. And Ime was maybe one of the last nails in that proverbial coffin. We've seen Philadelphia get uncomfortable before, the Ben Simmons situation, most notably. Ben Simmons requests a trade, shows up at training camp, kind of, drifts through it. Doc Rivers throws him out of practice. I mean, all the things that happened during that last season for Ben in Philadelphia. Do you see similarities here where the Sixers, are going to be willing to get uncomfortable if they don't get the kind of deal they're looking for?
I do see similarities. Like, I don't know if they're going to be willing to get as uncomfortable, just because of you have a new coach and Nick Nurse, and they have so much on the line this season, to where, I think if they don't get out of the second round, Daryl Morey could be out of here, right? I mean, so it's to a point where, I think that they hope that they hurry up and get this thing quickly resolved beforehand, right? But there are a lot of similarities, man. Like, everything I wrote a article a couple of yesterday, and I called it drama, and that's what it is. It's the same situation. Like, this is basically how the Ben Simmons thing started. He met with them. He said he didn't want to be here anymore. He told them he did a lot of different things. It was like everything was being reported through social media. The teammates were trying to talk him into come back and playing. He refused to meet with them. Well, James hung out with his guys, but they wanted to talk him back into. He doesn't want to come. The difference is Doc, back then it was Doc Rivers and Ben Simmons having a beef. Now it's apparently James Harden and Daryl Morey having a beef. Like, it just seems like.
Can you imagine that? Just to put a pause on that, Keith, like 5 years ago, if you had said James Harden and Daryl Morey will be beefing after Daryl paid him like $250 million effectively to do whatever he wanted in Houston, I wouldn't have believed that.
Exactly. And that's the crazy thing about it. Like, these two guys are supposed to be, tied to the hip. I mean, they're so close. when James signed with the Sixers, everyone's like thinking, okay, is this going to be James' team or Joel's team?
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden they're beefing. So it's crazy. And for Nick Nurse, you hope that it doesn't go down there because the thing about James, Ben was a younger guy. James is the master of getting out of situations he doesn't want to be in, right? And
Mhm.
and you hope that for his future earnings that he doesn't jeopardize that. But we all know, like the quote unquote fat suit, the hamstring in Brooklyn. If James doesn't want to be somewhere, he could make it very uncomfortable, and he's telling them that. But I do think that the Sixers is in their best bet, and it was in their is in I think it's best for them to get this thing resolved before the season starts because it's going to be a lost season. And I think it could lead to, Daryl losing his job. Because let's face it, James is his problem. He's the one that brought James here.
Well, I think that 4-point in 37-minute performance Harden had in his last game in Brooklyn was a masterclass in how to show your team that you don't want to be there. I guess the last thing I'd turn to is this is all done against the backdrop of what's best for Joel Embiid. And we're at about the 2-week point of when Embiid made those comments at the Uninterrupted Festival where he said, I could win a championship in Philadelphia or someplace else. Now, everyone has tried to walk that back, whether it's Embiid on Twitter, Daryl Morey in interviews. But you know as well as anyone, Keith, Joel's not an idiot. When Joel says something, he knows exactly what he's saying and when he's saying it and the end result of what he's saying. So I believe there was purpose behind those words. What do you think is best for the future of the Sixers with Joel Embiid? What outcome in all this placates Joel Embiid enough, I guess, even if it doesn't get you to that championship level for next season alone? What's the best decision for Joel Embiid?
I think the best decision for Joel Embiid this upcoming season would be looking at the options out there. The best decision for Joel Embiid is if James decides to stay. And if
I
James
agree.
decides, you know what I mean? And if James decides, I'm going to be this facilitator and we'll win it and then move on, because anything else is like rebuild. And what Joel said something in that interview was talking about continuity, right? And Joel's looking everywhere else. If you can bring James and Joel back together for this one last year with Tobias and then you see what they can do. And then you can talk to Joel in the offseason. Hey, look, now we got a lot of cap space.
Mm-hmm.
We tried it. Let's try to rebuild it right now. How do you feel about that? But right now, I don't see you pairing Joel with a bunch of role players and draft picks that you don't know who they're going to turn out to be, or if you're going to be able to get anyone on them from that. I just feel like it's best to keep James.
That's the thing too. Next summer, you're going to have Joel under contract and Tyrese Maxey presumably about to sign a big contract. That's two pretty good building blocks. You got the MVP and a guy that looks like at worst a fringy all-star type. And then whatever amount, $70-80 million coming off the books in the form of Harden and Tobias Harris. And even if Harden even if he's not saying I'm buying in, I want to be back, I'd still bring him back because I'd still dare him to be the guy that he was in Houston and be the guy that he was at the end in Brooklyn, because it's in his own self-interest to be the best he can be, to be the James Harden. Because if he goes out there and spends 3 months moping through the season, those offers that he wants, they're not going to be there next summer. Like he's going to be chasing mid-level exceptions for the next couple of years if he doesn't play like the guy we at least saw last season. I just think, and look, if he does buy in, I look around the league, Keith, and I don't see too many teams that I say you're definitely better than Philadelphia. Like Boston, I think they got a little bit worse. Miami, for now, they got worse. Milwaukee, still really good, but a year older, and we'll see what happens with some of their injuries. Even out west, the Nuggets, they lost guys. Memphis is going to the season without Ja Morant for probably a quarter of it. So I think if you're Philadelphia, while it is a risk to bring a guy that doesn't want to be there back into the fold, especially a guy that could teach a class on how to remove yourself from a situation you don't like, your best chance to win and even long-term protect your future, because Harden will come off the books next year, is just bring him back and say, play. Otherwise, whatever happens is on you.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And especially like when you look at the 76ers and, they did lose some people in free agency, but they were also guys who didn't really make an impact in the second round of playoffs, or in most instances weren't even in the rotation, right? So the Sixers let those guys go. And you look at Nick Nurse's coaching ability, and you feel like that the Sixers felt like in the game 6, they were one quarter away from advancing to the Eastern Conference Final. And you talk about how Nick Nurse gets the best out of 6'9" power forwards who are mobile. Tobias Harris, how like he developed young guards, Tyrese Maxey. Joel Embiid, he likes pitting stars in perfect situations, right? So when you have a guy like Nick Nurse, you can say with the team that we had and we bring you back in the fold, James, hey, we can go to the finals, right? We can go there, So I agree 100%. But again, it has to be one of those things where James has to be totally bought in, totally bought in. And as bad as some people might say he played last year, he still was a 21-10, like 21-10. James
Not
Harden would
nothing.
have been an all-star if he wouldn't have missed as many games, right? So he reinvented himself and he led the league in assists. There were multiple games where he had more than 13 assists out there. So if he buys in and he's dedicated, like you're right, they are going to have a pretty good team, a very good team. But it's just that because I think Nick Nurse is going to get the most out of this team and do things that Doc Rivers didn't do. It's not a knock on Doc. I just feel like Nick Nurse is a guy who's done more with less and has been able to get teams to play better than what their ceiling is. And I think he'll do that for them.
He's also a guy that, has experience with not a disgruntled star in terms of Kawhi Leonard, but the will he or won't he stay dynamic. Like he's experienced with that. Like, so the awkwardness of having a player that may not be there next year. Well, Nick Nurse won a championship with that awkwardness. So I take my chances with him on the bench as well. All right, Keith. Well, I hope this situation resolves itself for your sake sooner rather than later, and you get a chance to enjoy some of the offseason. But I appreciate you joining me here, man.
Man, I appreciate you having me on your podcast.